The majority of techniques we have discussed have applied the behavior change tools to children, including toddlers and elementary school age children, all the way through preteens. An important question is whether the tools can apply to adolescents. This is important to ask because some of the tools we have discussed, such as effusive praise and timeout, seem completely out of touch with the realities of dealing with a maturing teenager. Actually, the techniques for changing and developing behavior have been used with toddlers, children, adolescents, adults, and the elderly. And they have been used in a variety of settings, such as the home, schools, universities, hospitals, business and industry, the military, professional athletics, and so on. So the tools in the parenting toolkit can readily be applied to adolescents, but how they are applied varies in important ways. There are two lessons that focus on behavior change strategies for adolescents. This is the first and focuses on how to adapt behavior change tools we have discussed in other lessons so they can be applied effectively to adolescents. The second introduces new tools that are especially useful with preteens and teens. They will make the interactions you have much more pleasant and effective. As usual, the goal of these lessons is to help with the challenges of parenting and child rearing. A few features of adolescence are quite relevant to those challenges. But before addressing these features, let me begin with some reassurance. While the period of adolescence can be challenging, most adolescents do fine and get through this period without major crises, and of course, so do their parents. So while many parents approach adolescence of their child with white knuckles and anti-anxiety medication, in fact, the usual process just has a few potholes rather than any major detours. At the same time, there are many changes in adolescence. I have selected two that can influence child rearing practices and our own sensitivities to what the adolescent is going through. First, we know that adolescence is a period of engaging in risky behaviors. Risky behaviors refer to those actions that can lead to health problems, serious injury, and even death. The risky behaviors include a long list, such as using or abusing alcohol, cigarette smoking, driving recklessly, engaging in unprotected sex, engaging in illegal activities such as vandalism and trespassing, not wearing seatbelts or bicycle helmets, being in a car with a driver who has been drinking, and being the perpetrator or victim of physical violence while dating. Obviously, many of these are dangerous, and there's an endless stream of statistics to convey that. For example, motor vehicle accidents account for approximately 25% of the deaths of adolescents. Related, a very large percentage of adolescents say that they email and text while they are driving. Given our focus on how to help and what can be done, it's worth knowing more about how to reduce risky behavior. Research tells us that risky behavior among teens is greatly influenced by many factors, but two are especially worth noting. First is the presence of peers. When with peers, the likelihood of doing something risky is much greater. So behaviors an adolescent might not have done now are much more likely when they're with their friends. Second is not being monitored by parents. That also increases the likelihood of engaging in risky behaviors. Now, monitoring does not mean being with the adolescents at all times or hovering. Rather, it means keeping track of where your child is, what he is doing, and who's he with. Outside the home, it's important to know where your adolescent is going after school or on weekends. You may think your child is at someone else's house with a parent there, but perhaps your adolescent is not at that house or is there, but in fact no parent is there. I have heard many stories where the parent tells me what the adolescent does after school, and then I speak to the adolescent's son or daughter to hear the real story, and sometimes they are not even close. You can monitor your adolescent with the use of cell phones and get in the habit of texting or phone calls. Now, monitoring is very important even when your child is at home. Keep an eye on the use of computers, smartphones, and tablets, and other such devices. Adolescents can use their devices to engage in activities that promote problem behaviors. Those activities include playing with video games that are violent or encourage stealing or property destruction, and engaging in online bullying where the teen is involved as a bully, as a victim, or even both. In short, be aware of risky behavior and monitor who your adolescent is with and where he or she is in the real world, but also in the virtual world of the internet. In a separate lesson on nurturing family environment, I speak a little bit more about monitoring and how to set the stage to make that easier in family life. The second characteristic I wish to mention is brain development. I cannot begin to outline the scope of changes in the brain here, but a few features may be useful for understanding the challenges for parents, but also for the adolescents themselves. So let's define adolescence here as the period from ages 10 to 12, about sexual maturity age, to about 20. There's no fixed period that defines adolescence, but those years capture the brain changes. Let us begin with the fact that the brain is not yet fully developed in adolescence, and during this period, it is developing unevenly. In other words, important brain functions are developing at different rates. Briefly consider two processes. First, consider decision-making and related processes. These include reasoning, stopping and thinking, self-control, delay of gratification, and not acting impulsively. These are sometimes called executive processes or executive function. Second, consider sensation seeking, and this is a summary term here to reflect impulsiveness, trying out new things, engaging in antisocial behavior such as vandalism, and of course taking risks. There is an unevenness in brain development because sensation seeking develops early in adolescence and decision making develops later. This means that the drive to act impulsively develops before the ability to control that impulsive behavior. Added to this, while the brain is developing at this time, the reward centers of the brain are very sensitive to social cues and peers. So the impulsiveness and the reward experience of risky behavior is much greater when one's with one's peers. One is familiar with the informal notion of peer pressure, which implies that peers are in some way pressuring conformity and risk-taking. There's more going on here, as the brain is activated in ways by the mere presence of peers, and that fosters more risk-taking. In fact, teens are similar to adults in their knowledge of risky behaviors and what can happen, but they are much more vulnerable to the reward value, sensation-seeking, and peer influences, and that increases actually doing the behaviors. So it's not so much a matter of the teen knowing better, but rather having better control. The main point here is that control of impulsive behavior is waiting for further brain development that comes only much later in adolescence. Now, one researcher has conveyed the uneven brain development in simple terms by drawing an analogy to a car, and specifically the gas pedal and the brakes. In terms of our simple understanding, the gas pedal of the adolescent is really well developed long before the brakes develop. Now, the comparison oversimplifies nuances of brain development, but it conveys the point in a way that's useful to us as parents. By the time an adolescent moves into the early 20s, decision-making catches up with impulsivity and sensation-seeking, and risky behavior is better controlled, and now it declines. Now, as a parent, it's important to note that these changes in the brain are real and can readily influence many of the things parents are concerned about. The brain is not yet developed to control behavior as much as we would like. Now, the findings about adolescent brain development has even influenced the U.S. Supreme Court and penalties for crimes committed by adolescents. The Supreme Court has prohibited states from ordering sentences that are for the entire life of the adolescent without parole. The reason is that adolescents, by virtue of their neurobiological immaturity, are not as responsible for their behavior as are adults. The decision stems exactly from what we're talking about, namely the uneven development of the brain. So it is important to note that maturation of teens involves so many influences related to physical and psychological states. Changes in physical states include hormones, physical appearance, and the brain as examples. Changes in psychological states include increases in hopelessness and reporting body image problems. Also, many psychiatric disorders such as anxiety, mood disorders, psychosis, eating disorders, substance abuse, these begin during adolescence. And these disorders are thought to be heavily influenced by the developing brain, beyond those processes I've mentioned. There's much going on with the adolescent, and national surveys add to that by showing that adolescents are quite stressed by what's going on in their lives. And some of these stressors are quite different from what they were in previous generations. For example, cyberbullying plays a role that is unlike bullying in prior years. Adolescents can now bully each other or be bullied by smartphone, tablet, computers, and also one can bully another person anonymously, so you have no idea who the bully is. From a parent standpoint, an adolescent may present special challenges because the usual parent-child interactions that may have worked well before have to be changed. If an adolescent appears to be more difficult than usual, there is so much going on physically, psychologically, and socially, this ought to be expected. Adolescents are not intentionally trying to be difficult or calculating ways to frustrate you. There is a way in which they too are along for the ride and coping with multiple changes of which they are not actually aware. But a key question for us is, what can parents do to ease the path through adolescence and continue to have a positive influence? There are many actions parents can take to help manage the difficulties that you might be experiencing with your adolescent. And so we've discussed tools for changing behavior in other lessons, including praise, developing positive opposite shaping, timeout, among others. The techniques are still relevant for your adolescent and still effective in changing behavior. However, they have to be applied differently. So let's consider three main techniques that we've discussed previously and the modifications that are needed to make them really effective with preteens and teens. First, let's consider praise. I have emphasized that one of the most effective behavior change tools you have at your disposal is that special praise that follows behavior that you wish to change. The praise included three ingredients, as you recall. One is providing very effusive or enthusiastic praise. Another, giving a clear statement noting exactly what is being praised. And then some affectionate or approving touch or positive and nonverbal gesture. For example, with a young child, these three ingredients would be illustrated by a parent saying, "Great! You cleaned up all of your toys on the floor. Very nicely done." And now walking over to the child and patting or touching or something like that that's affectionate. With adolescents, the three ingredients are modified. First, we still need the praise itself, just not effusive praise. It is better to go over to the adolescent and just state more calmly and in a matter-of-fact way, "This was great. That was really nice." No effusive praise, and whispered praise would even be quite fine. If there's anyone in the room, go over and say the praise privately, because social sensitivities may make the adolescent prone to easy embarrassment. Second, it is still important to say exactly what you are praising in very concrete terms. So you might say, "It is really nice when we chat like this when you get home from school," or "Thanks for letting me know you'll be coming home a half hour late today." Again, this is stated without wild enthusiasm, but it is important to clarify exactly what is being praised. And third, it is still important to do something nonverbal that you add to the praise. Many adolescents may actually shy away or move away from being touched. If that is true with your adolescent, make your gesture in the air without actually touching. From 5 or 10 feet away, you can just slap the air to denote a high five. You can raise your hand about the level of your face, put one thumb up, or you can raise both hands and be enthusiastic but not really touch your child. These gestures or others like that convey the same message and are important to add. Again, the key here is to provide the gesture. If you feel that touching, patting, hugging, or direct contact will be fine, of course, just do that. In any case, special praise is still very effective, and for adolescents, it needs to be toned down a little bit. The second technique to modify for adolescents is attending and planned ignoring. Attending is noticing when someone is doing some behavior that you wish to increase and then providing attention by smiling, asking pleasant questions, talking nicely, hugging, or giving the child a pat on the back. Praise is one type of attention, but it is important to note that attention includes many additional means of developing the behaviors you wish. Planned ignoring is systematically ignoring or not paying attention to the behaviors you wish to decrease. These techniques can be used without change for adolescents. I mention them here because they are underused, and that can really raise problems. For example, parents often comment that their adolescents speak to them horribly, roll their eyes when the parents say anything, and act in ways that are not very nice to the parent. Remember, the adolescent is caught up in all sorts of biological and psychological changes, and the temporary departure from you and your values and rules can be part of that process. Yet if you are concerned about any of the new negative behaviors that have emerged, there is a great deal you can do. This is exactly the time to rely much more heavily on using attention and planned ignoring. Keep in mind that your adolescent is not always acting the ways you do not care for. It is absolutely critical that you attend and comment and be responsive for those moments when those behaviors occur that you wish to foster and increase. Chances are very high that you are not seizing the opportunities to attend to positive opposites that are going on all of the time. Ignore what you can of the behaviors you might find offensive, but my experience is that parents are letting go virtually all the times the adolescent is acting quite fine. Do not get trapped into these little arguments about what is wrong or what you do not like. When you do that, you are giving attention to negative behaviors, and that can actually maintain the very behaviors you want to eliminate. Draw on attending and planned ignoring much more if you are concerned about the interactions you are having with your adolescent. One sign that it might be good to use much more attending and planned ignoring is if you find yourself complaining regularly to yourself, partner, or teenager about how difficult it is sometimes to interact with your adolescent. Pay special attention to positive conversation around the house, while on an errand or in the car, or comments about his or her school day. Think of these pleasant interactions. To help you think about this strategically, pause this video and list all those pleasant interactions that occurred yesterday. The purpose is to help you catch those interactions by attending more. That will increase their occurrence and decrease the behaviors you are not particularly fond of. As an exercise, tomorrow, try to attend a few times to any of those positive behaviors and try to ignore the behavior you wish to decrease. Third technique I want to talk about is the use of punishment. And that deserves special comment because what happens in adolescence. I have noted two main points about punishment in other lessons, and these still apply. First, if punishment is used, it ought to play a minor role in any behavior change program. And second, when punishment is used, it should be brief and mild. I have recommended a minor role because punishment is not very effective in changing behavior when used alone or in teaching the behaviors you wish to develop. Punishment should be brief and mild because more punishment, more intense punishment, or longer punishment does not increase its effectiveness in changing behavior. More intense punishment just gets everyone more upset, produces more negative side effects such as aggression and wanting to escape from one's parents. I spoke about timeout for reinforcement. Usually timeout consists of having a child sit in an isolated place for a few minutes or not have access to some activity. This procedure is not going to be feasible with adolescents because we cannot control the adolescent going easily to timeout. It is unimaginable for a 16-year-old to say to a parent, "Okay, Mom, I'm going to timeout. Where would you like me to sit for the next 5 minutes?" It's just not going to happen. It's better to use a brief loss of a privilege. Have something in mind ahead of time that is brief that you control. For example, you might take away use of a cell phone for an evening or perhaps watching movies for that evening. Just keep it brief. Keep in mind that the punishment, even if mild, leads to escape from the person and the situation where punishment is given, and eventually leads to avoidance. Now, many adolescents are already doing things to escape and avoid their parents. They go to their room and they keep the door closed. They may try not to even eat dinner with the family, and they may avoid conversation that is not absolutely essential. So the recommendation is minimal punishment if and when you feel you have to use any at all. But the emphasis should always be on attending and planned ignoring. The punishment will increase tension in the home and between you and your adolescent, and it will really achieve very little in changing behavior. Attending and ignoring are likely to decrease tension and make the interactions much more pleasant. Let me summarize by connecting the different facets of today's lesson. I mentioned how the adolescent is going through dramatic changes. I highlighted two of these very briefly by mentioning an increase in risky behaviors and some changes in the development of the brain that relate to these behaviors. It is equally important to reassure you that most parents and adolescents pass through this stage well and without crises. On the other hand, this could also be the period in which you need the tools to maintain family life, good communication, and routines. The tools we have discussed are very effective with adolescents. They have to be applied somewhat differently from how they were used with young children. Perhaps of all things to emphasize in this summary would be the use of attending and planned ignoring. It is likely that scores of opportunities are missed when you and your adolescent interact calmly, engage in respectful communications, and just have moments of quality time together. Attend more to these with praise, just talking, providing feedback at how nice the interaction was and how much you liked it. If your adolescent is not introducing any new sources of frustration, you may not need to go to the tools we have discussed. There is another lesson on adolescence which covers new tools worth integrating into the home. Both lessons on adolescence should give you ways of easing any difficulties in the home, making the life of your family and adolescent smoother, and directly helping your adolescent negotiate the complexities of this period.